Uganda has billions of barrels of oil beneath its soil. But for years, there was one enormous problem. Uganda has no coastline. So to get its oil onto the global market, it needed a pipeline stretching more than 1,400 kilometers across East Africa. The price? Roughly $5 billion. But then the money became a problem. Major Western lenders pulled back from direct project financing amid climate and human rights pressure. And Uganda was left searching for another way to finance the final stretch. Then Uganda looked toward Beijing. China was already inside Uganda's oil industry, already inside the pipeline, and now Chinese lenders are being considered as part of the remaining debt financing. So why is China betting on Uganda's controversial oil pipeline? And what could Beijing gain if it helps finance the road to the Indian Ocean? The story begins in western Uganda. Commercial oil discoveries in the Lake Albert region transformed the country's economic ambitions. Uganda estimates roughly 6.5 billion barrels of petroleum resources in place. But that does not mean Uganda can pump all of it. Government figures put recoverable resources at around 1.4 billion barrels. Still, that is enough to transform a landlocked economy, if they get it to market. The solution is EACOP, a 1,443-kilometer export pipeline running from Uganda's oil region to the Chongoleani Peninsula near Tanga, Tanzania. The pipeline is buried and insulated. Because Uganda's crude is waxy, it must be kept hot enough to remain mobile during transport. The system is designed to transport up to 246,000 barrels per day. That makes EACOP Uganda's physical connection to the international oil market. Without the pipeline, Uganda has oil. With the pipeline, Uganda has an export route, and that distinction is worth billions of dollars. But the pipeline needed money. The original model envisioned 60% debt and 40% equity. Banks and other lenders would provide the rest. Environmental organizations targeted EACOP, arguing the project threatened ecosystems and climate goals. Banks were pressured not to participate. Several major Western financial institutions ultimately withdrew. Among the names associated with the withdrawal were BNP Paribas, Société Générale, and Barclays. But there is a nuance. This does not mean Western banks abandoned Total Energies itself. Some continued to underwrite their corporate bonds. So the controversy did not make the oil disappear. It made the financing more complicated, and that created a gap. The shareholders had a choice: wait for the banks, or put in more of their own money. EACOP's ownership is divided between 4 partners. That last number matters, because China was not suddenly arriving at the project. China was already there through CNOOCs. Beijing wasn't looking at a foreign project. It was looking at a system where one of China's biggest oil companies already had a seat at the table. But CNOOC's 8% stake is only part of the story. The bigger question is, who will provide the debt that the pipeline still needs? As conventional financing became harder to secure, Uganda turned toward China. Ugandan Energy Minister Ruth Nankabirwa traveled to Beijing to meet potential Chinese financiers. Among the institutions discussed was China's Export-Import Bank. The objective was straightforward: help close the remaining debt financing gap. And the timing was significant, because by this point, the project had already demonstrated something important. Uganda was willing to keep building even when international project finance became difficult. That meant the financing opportunity was no longer theoretical. The infrastructure was physically taking shape. The oil fields were being developed. The pipeline was advancing. And the Tanga export terminal was being prepared. China, therefore, wasn't simply being asked to finance an idea. It was being asked to help finance the final stages of a strategic energy corridor. For Beijing, that creates several potential advantages. First, energy. CNOOC already has an upstream interest in Uganda. Second, infrastructure. Chinese companies are supplying significant equipment and pipe for the project. Third, finance. Chinese banks could potentially become lenders. And fourth, geopolitical influence. But there is a major caveat. China has not simply replaced every Western lender. The financing story is much more complicated. Here's where the simple China versus West narrative breaks down. In March 2025, EACOP announced the closing of its first external financing tranche. The lenders included major African and regional institutions: Afreximbank, Standard Bank, Stanbic Bank Uganda, KCB Bank Uganda. So the pipeline did not simply go from Western banks out to Chinese banks in. Instead, the financing structure became more diversified. Regional banks stepped forward, shareholders increased their financial exposure, and Chinese lenders remained part of the conversation over the remaining debt. By 2026, Uganda's energy minister said equity had risen from the original 40% to almost 52%. Total Energies agreed to inject another $400 million. Uganda committed another $45 million, and Tanzania was expected to match Uganda's contribution. The message was clear. The shareholders were prepared to carry more of the project themselves, but the debt problem had not disappeared. And that is exactly why China's role remained important. So what does it actually mean to say China is betting on EACOP? It does not mean China owns the pipeline. It doesn't. Total Energies owns 62%. CNOOC owns only 8%. The Chinese bet is more strategic. China already has an upstream position through CNOOC. Chinese companies are involved in the wider oil development. Chinese equipment is entering the construction chain. And Chinese financial institutions are being approached for the remaining debt. That creates something more valuable than ownership alone. Position. Beijing could become connected through an entire chain: production, infrastructure, finance, and export. That is where the geopolitical significance begins. And the timing matters. EACOP is no longer a proposal on a map. It is nearly built. Uganda's Investment Authority reported that by June 30th, 2026, the pipeline had reached around 90% overall progress, while EACOP itself reported 88% completion in July 2026. Those numbers vary by reporting date and methodology, but the direction is unmistakable. The project is entering its final stage. Uganda is approaching first oil. Tanzania is preparing to become the export gateway, and Tanga is positioned to become an even more important part of East Africa's energy infrastructure. The pipeline that once struggled to attract conventional project finance is now approaching physical completion. And this brings us back to the title. Why is China betting on Uganda's $5 billion oil pipeline? Because the opportunity is bigger than the pipeline itself. Uganda is becoming an oil producer. Tanzania is becoming the export corridor. CNOOC already has a stake in the upstream projects in EACOP. Chinese companies are participating in the supply chain, and Chinese banks are being considered as part of the financing solution. For Beijing, that creates strategic connectivity. Not control, not ownership, but connectivity. And connectivity can become influence. For Uganda, the calculation is different. Kampala wants to monetize its oil. For Tanzania, EACOP strengthens the strategic importance of its Indian Ocean coastline. For China, it creates another relationship linking African energy resources with Chinese capital, companies, and markets. And for the West, there is an uncomfortable question. If Western financial institutions increasingly reduce direct exposure to controversial fossil fuel infrastructure, who fills the space they leave behind? EACOP was supposed to be Uganda's route from oil discovery to energy wealth. But the journey has become something much bigger. It has become a test of how Africa's strategic infrastructure is financed. In a changing global financial system, Western financial pressure changed EACOP's financing structure and created a larger strategic opening for China. The pipeline is almost finished. The oil is coming. And the next question is no longer simply, who owns Uganda's oil? It is, who finances the road that takes it to the world? Horn Times. Subscribe for more geopolitical documentaries from Africa.